On behalf of the Ascension Parish Library, thank you so much for taking part in this Who Gets to Vote reading and discussion series. This 4-week series is intended to spark dialogue and encourage critical thinking around issues and themes on the history of voting in the United States. The Who Gets to Vote reading and discussion series is presented by the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities and then made available through the Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our scholar for this series, Dr. Catherine Jacquet. Dr. Jacquet is an Associate Professor of History and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Affiliate Professor of African and African American Studies at LSU. Let's all welcome our presenter and Dr. Catherine Jacquet, and I will call you Kat from now on.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Ashley. Well, it's great to be here. I'm really excited. Usually I'm working with students on LSU's campus and we're having academics conversations about books. So it's also fun to have like a less kind of super nerdy academic conversation, but have a good conversation, right, about what we're learning and what we're reading. So thank you so much to the Ascension Parish Library for having me, and Chrisella Henry and Ashley Lewis. Ashley's here with us. Thank you so much for everything you've done to organize this. The Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, who put together this incredible series, Who Gets to Vote. I think it's really important for us, as citizens to really have I'm also a historian, so of course I think understanding the history is very important. But it is, right, to understand the history of voting in this country, to understand what the future of voting looks like and what is our current situation with voting. Is there a crisis? Is there not a crisis? What's going on, right? And if we have the historical background, we can better understand that. So as Ashley said, I am a historian at LSU. I teach courses in history and women's gender and sexuality studies. I'm focused on 20th century women's history and also history of sexuality. And what that means, because people never understand what the history of sexuality is. Yes, it does include LGBTQ history, but also includes, things like history of birth control, history of reproduction, history of abortion, history of marriage, history of courtship, all of those things. So I've been at LSU this is my 7th year. I love it. It's just a fantastic job. The students are great. I've taught women's history classes. I've taught US history classes. So anyway, looking forward to a good conversation. Hopefully if you all have questions about the history, even though I will say right now, I am not a textbook. I am not Wikipedia. I wish I had all that information in my head, but I don't. But hopefully I have, I can answer any questions you all have about the history, or if not, I can tell you where to find it. So what I thought we would do is maybe go around and just have each person just introduce themselves, just say hello, maybe tell us, who you are and whatever relevant information. And then I was also thinking, since yesterday was International Women's Day, and we're talking about the women's suffrage movement today, if there is a woman, either a historical figure or somebody that that has inspired you in your life that you want to share with the group, just as a way to get us talking a little bit. So who wants to volunteer to go first?
I guess I'll go first.
Great.
Matthew Hernandez. I'm a retired I was with the Sheet Metal Workers Union. I'm a 50-year member of the Sheet Metal Workers Union, and very interested in voting rights and expanding the franchise so that make it easier for everyone to be able to, that's qualified, to be able to vote.
Awesome. Thanks, Matthew. Do you have an inspiring woman, either a historical figure, someone that you want to share?
Well, I think that Katie Stanton was probably her and Susan B. Anthony, and women like Eleanor Roosevelt, the real pioneers that got the women's movement started.
Yeah, they were doing some things. Cool. Well, thanks for your intro, Matthew, and we love unions. I wish we could get a union at LSU for the faculty. So, um, yeah, that'll be the day.
Good luck to you.
Yeah, thanks. Cool. Okay, so let's see. Renee, I'll read your intro. So she says, "Hi, I'm Renee Brinkhouse, and I love learning and that the library hosts these events and happy to be here. Yay! I try to attend as much as I can. Susan B. Anthony and Eleanor Roosevelt, as well as Margaret Thatcher. Fantastic. Cool. Thanks for sharing, Renee, and thanks for being here. And I think we're probably all lifelong learners here, right? I mean, all of us, because we're engaged in these kinds of conversations. So that's really fantastic. So glad to have you here. Either Timothy or Thomas, do you want to introduce yourself?
Okay, I'll go. My name is Tim Babin, lifelong resident of Louisiana. Just here to learn what's going on and that kind of thing, and be able to share a little bit if that happens. But and the inspiring women in my life and that I know of, my grandmother and my mother, who nearly starved to death in the Depression and went sometimes days without eating as a single divorced mom at that time, which was not really something that happened a lot. You didn't hear about that back then too much. But she had to make it on her own and worked ungodly hours all the time just to make ends meet, and they didn't make ends meet. So they were inspiring to me, and how we and my brother and my sister run our lives today. Even just certain things about it, we can tell, boy, that goes back to our mother and grandmother, that kind of thing. So that's it.
Super cool. Glad to have you here. Welcome. Thanks for sharing about your mom and your grandmother. Ashley, since you are here, even though you're hosting, do you want to introduce yourself too?
Yes. Hi, I'm Ashley. I'm the reference librarian here at the Gonzales Library. And yeah, I live in Baton Rouge. I went to college, away for college a long time ago, and came back. I used to live in Gonzales, but now I live in Baton Rouge. So I grew up here. And so for inspiring women, I'm really inspired by women poets like Mary Oliver, Audre Lorde, a lot of women poets, and even older and newer than that, who are kind of share this sort of female experience with the world and make a space for that. And also by my partner, who I don't want to ever be like, because a person's not a sob story, but she's been through so much. And it's like just really inspiring to me every day to kind of see like the medical stuff, the medical problems and poverty induced stuff that compared to my life, which has been relatively shiny. So yeah, that's my inspiring women.
Cool.
And that's me.
Thank you for your intro.
Thank you.
So it's nice because it sounds like we have a really good group of folks here. People are coming from different life experiences, which always makes for the best conversations. As I always tell my students, it's when you have more diverse experiences in the classroom that really enriches the conversation. It's also really wonderful when people come into a classroom or a space like this with some knowledge, no knowledge, a lot of knowledge, right, on the subject, right? So no matter where people are at in terms of, learning about this stuff, we're all here to learn more about it together, right? So I don't expect any of you to be, for my assumption was for most folks, they didn't really know that much about the history of women's voting, that, this book might be like the first time you've ever read anything about women's suffrage. And kudos if you knew more or not, right? So cool. Well, let's dive into the conversation about the book. This is more of an academic book, but I think it's written really in an accessible manner. So it's not, it's not like high theory and all of that. But she has a very clear, sharp argument and point, and she's talking about how history gets created, right? And there's multiple ways to think about that. One is like people who are actually like on the ground making history. Another way to think about that is people who are then telling that history, right, and creating a narrative about the past. And so this book is looking at this narrative of the Seneca Falls Convention, which is seen as like the pinnacle moment of, you know, the origin story of women's rights and women's suffrage. And where does that story come from, right? We have origin stories for almost anything, right? So, you know, in thinking about this book, we can also be thinking about what are other moments in history that are seen as like the beginning point, and when, you know, when were those stories created, right? So I'm going to use, Ashley, did people get the reading guide questions in advance or just me? You're on mute.
Sorry. People did get the reading guide questions in advance. I don't believe that there was like a reading schedule. There was, you know, each week the book for that week, but there wasn't like anything like more specific. But it did have the questions.
Okay, I just want to know if people knew what I was talking about. If I was like, I'm now going to refer to the questions, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we have.
Okay. Cool. Okay, so yeah, maybe we'll just dive into these, the discussion guide question, because again, you know, the way I'm imagining these conversations are actual conversations, right? I'm not imagining me coming up here and like lecturing to you guys for an hour. I'm imagining that, you know, we're gonna talk to one another and talk about what we've read and you know, go that route. So maybe let's just start, you know, in thinking about before you read this book, what did you know of the history of women's rights activism or the history of women in the vote in the United States? Because that's always really interesting to think about our own starting points before we start learning about topics. So, you know, what were some of the things that you, or some people or some events or some of the things that you already knew about history of women's rights or women in the vote? Any volunteers to answer that question?
I really didn't know a whole lot about what was going on. I mean, we knew when the right to vote came up in the, you know, in the early part of the century, last century, but other than that, I didn't know much. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Timothy. So, right, women, you know, the 19th Amendment is passed in 1920. So, you know, there's one moment that might be familiar to some of us, right? And of course, that amendment was called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, right? So it's also very relevant, and Tetrault, the author, talks about that too. Anything else that folks knew about the history of women's history or the vote? Renee wrote very little other than we had to fight for it. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
This is Matthew. I watched a series on PBS about prohibition.
Okay.
And it seemed like, from what I remember of the series, the movement, the women's movement to get rid of alcohol, once it was passed and then repealed, kind of morphed. A lot of the same people got involved in women's suffrage and moved on from there, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
But
yeah, and I will say those PBS series are excellent. There's a whole series like The American Experience. They do a really nice job with PBS. So hurrah for public broadcasting. But you're right, is that there is a lot of overlap between women who are involved in the temperance movement, right? And the movement for temperance is to, you know, essentially get rid of alcohol. And the suffrage movement. And in fact, you know, the temperance movement, very often historians will talk about it as an early movement against domestic violence, because these women were arguing that men were getting drunk and coming home and beating wives and children. And so as a way to contain that, to reduce violence at home, was to make alcohol illegal. So
get rid of alcohol.
That's right. Yeah. So that's very interesting. But yeah, there's absolutely overlap between those two groups of people. Yeah. Yeah, Renee, you never heard that. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. And so here's another question for you all too. And Thomas, since your speaker is not working, also, as we told Renee earlier, like, chat in on the chat so we can hear from you too. Something that also, like, why do you think it is that you all don't have that much knowledge on the history of women in the vote or women's rights?
Not very good. Not very good history classes when we were coming up.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it begs the question. Anyway, sorry, Timothy, what were you going to say? It was never discussed. That's what Renee said. What, were you going to say something, Timothy?
Yeah, I mean, matter of factly, what I was going to say was that it was something that, I was never all that interested in. If I'd have been interested in it, I would have devoured it because, like World War II or World War I or Revolutionary War periods or different types of bios that I read, that kind of thing, I devour those things. But I haven't yet, different parts of your life, you start putting in gear some of the things that you want. So you go from first gear to second gear to third gear on some of these different things, so maybe this is the start of it. I saw it, I thought that maybe it'd be an interesting class, so maybe that's the start of going from neutral to first gear, so to speak, and try to get into it, because I believe that learning just begins once you get out of school. And probably, I've been reading voraciously all my life, but it really kicked in about that when I was around 23 or 24. And so I started reading, and I just can't put books down now. And so, now that I'm 58, I'm still reading 20 or 30 or 40 books a year. So I'm trying to get more knowledge on a lot of different things. So I think that's one of the reasons too. And when it sets it on fire, it sets it on fire,
That's awesome. Well, I hope we can set you on fire and that you want to keep reading women's history. But yeah, just to speak to what you all said here, thinking about whose histories get told and whose histories don't get told, right? And it's not even a matter of like, and thinking about like what histories do you need to know, like thinking back to like high school, whenever that was 20, 30 years ago, right? Or longer. I know for me, it was, a long while ago. Thinking about whose histories do we learn about and whose histories show up on the state exams, right? And whatever history shows up on these state exams tells you, oh, this is important history and this is interesting history. So even off the bat, we're already being told which histories are important, which ones are actually interesting, right? As opposed to, and thinking about, again, this other question of how history gets made or whose stories get told, right? Who makes those decisions? So that's just something that, we want to talk about a little bit more. I have students at LSU when they come to my large US survey class, they learn all this women's history that they'd never learned before. They learn a lot of African American history that they'd never learned before. They learn a lot of Native American history that they'd never learned before. Right? And thinking about like, why aren't these histories incorporated into a broader US history framework, right? As like the standard framework. Yeah, it's exactly who stories get told, right? I mean, especially if you're thinking about women's history, right? I mean, last time I checked, I think women are 51% of the population, right? So then why is it that half the population's histories are not deemed as part of this larger narrative, important enough to be part of the larger narrative, right? So anyway, so just something to be thinking about, right? Especially as we get through the next few weeks of books. Next week, we're reading Vanguard, which is about African-American women in the battle for the vote. And that's definitely a history that's very often left out of the mainstream narrative. Okay, so let's keep moving then. So let's see, question number 2. thinking about, so I'll just read the question out loud. So in 1866, Lucretia Mott urged young women activists to, quote, make yourselves acquainted with the history of the women's rights movement. So her call was not unique to her movement. In fact, almost every major social movement, from 19th century suffrage to 20th century movements for civil rights, women's liberation, gay liberation, Chicano liberation, so many more, have sought to know and tell that group's histories. So why do you all think that knowing one's history is a critical component of the activist impulse? And why is history so important to movement building? What do you all think? And I can also provide a little bit more context too. I'll be the historian here. So, you know, in the 1960s, when you get the emergence of it, or like the 1950s, 1960s, emergence of a massive civil rights movement, a lot of what was also happening there was the reclaiming of Black history, right? Black scholars were telling the past, you know, as opposed to a Black history that had formerly been told from the perspective of white folks. They were telling a history that looked quite different, right? Where slavery was not celebrated, for example. Same thing with the women's liberation movement. A lot of the work in women's liberation and feminism in the 1960s was also reclaiming a women's history that had up to that point not been told, or when it was told, women were just kind of like the helpers on the side who didn't do much, right? So just with those two examples, thinking about then, why do you think social movements look to the past and seek to reclaim their history when they're making arguments for liberation now, if that makes sense? What's the value in the history?
Well, there's always value in history, because, you know, but, you know, if they're going to go back and realign what was happened to tell the truth of what the facts that really happened, well, that's important. If they're going to retell the what they say is their truth and it's not really the facts, but it's only their truth, that's not good either. I think as consumers of history, we want to know exactly the truth and nothing that is pushing something else. So in this case, I think that's one of the reasons we're wanting to go back to hear what the actual truth was and set it straight as to what the facts are.
Yeah, and that's important, right? Because let's say, for example, women activists in the 1970s with women's liberation, right? They're going to go back to the past and say, actually, women did X, Y, and Z in history, that women were more than just, you know, helpers, or, you know, that women were not just these useless, you know, people who did not work, who didn't contribute, who didn't do anything, right? Because what they're trying to do is change people's perceptions today. And then you have to say, well, yeah, I mean, historically, everything that's been said about us is actually quite inaccurate, right? Black folks had to do the same thing. You know, in the early 20th century, the narrative that was written about Black folks in the South and slavery was a narrative of slavery was good for Black people, and that they were better in you know, as enslaved people. And that, you know, white slave owners were very caring and kind, that it was a plantation family, right? I mean, this was the narrative that was told. And so then if you know, people had to go back in their past and say, actually, that's not true, right? Slavery is an institution based on violence. Enslaved people were not better off enslaved. I mean, it's so obvious for us to be saying now. It's almost weird to say because it's so obvious. But those were the challenges that people were facing at the time. So, you know, when we're thinking about the work of a social justice movement and what they're trying to do in seeking liberation, they're also trying to reclaim their own humanity, and reclaim their own sense of history, right? Any other thoughts on that?
I have some, if it's okay if I share as a host, so I'm not just staring creepily. But I think like I went to a women's college, and that was an experience where kind of a lot of our traditions celebrated things like women's labor movements and the suffragists fight and stuff like that. And so it really kind of opened, like, when you open that narrative of history and you open the complexity of it and the fact that women have been doing this and have done all of these things for centuries, millennia. People of color have been doing this for millennia. LGBT people have, it opens, it unflattens history. Like, it makes more things possible for the future, because you can see the people who fought in ways that you fought, or that you, things that fought for changes that you still want to see and stuff like that. And it gives you, even like, if you're someone who is a little, if you're an unconventional woman, like in any kind of way, it gives you a vision of what's possible beyond those flattened narratives of that have been used against people who are like oppressed in one way or another.
Yeah, I love that term, this like flattening of history, right? Because history is not flat, right? History is varied and unpredictable and, just like thrilling and interesting and exciting. And of course, I'm such a nerdy historian that I think so, but right. But then very often, like, a narrative that gets told is completely like can flatten that out. And that's just not true. And it also does not help us to understand the reality of people's lives, the reality of, like, even if you're thinking about like, how this country, has been transformed and shaped and changed over time, right? If you're leaving out significant actors from that, you're not getting that full narrative. And then when people get left out of the past, the assumption is like, well, they're not that important. They haven't been that important then. They're not important now. And also the fact, that's important for people to say, hey, we've actually been here for a really long time, right? So that was part of the gay liberation movement too, is like, we've been here for a really long time. We're not new, and we're not asking for like these new and special rights, because we've always existed. So it's really interesting to think about those connections, and why history is so important, and why history can be so important for people who are organizing for their own liberation. So what you see is, like, in academia, now we have women's history, we have African American history, we have Chicano history, we have all these different kinds of histories. And those all emerge out of the social movements of the mid 20th century. So they're very much connected to these political moments. So that's also, something to also be thinking about. And, more recent histories that have emerged in academia, like transgender history, has emerged as a field. It's very recent, the 1990s, right? Meanwhile, trans and non-binary people have always existed. But again, it goes back to that first question of whose histories are deemed important, who is given full humanity, who is seen as important, and also whose histories are deemed important, are very much connected there. Okay, let's jump to the next question. Actually, I want to jump to a question about voting and women's voting. And so I'm curious to hear what you all think about this. So, because very oftentimes, I'm looking at question number 4 about voting, and very oftentimes we think voting is a right that is just embedded in the Constitution and is just part of, like, well, yes, in the United States of America, everybody has the right to vote. So the question says, during the 19th century, voting was not understood as a basic right of citizenship. And the Supreme Court case Minor versus Happerstat, the court ruled that, quote, voting was not in fact a right of citizenship. It was rather a privilege to which not all citizens were entitled. So this will likely come as a surprise to many readers who assume that voting is a right enshrined in the Constitution. So consider the widely held belief that the country was founded on a democratic model in which voting is a right and should be accessible to all. So how does that story inform our own perceptions of the United States, its ideals and its history, as well as what democracy means? What do you all think? Or, like, in other words, like, if we believe that, in the United States, voting has always been a right that most people can access, and maybe a few people had to fight for, like women and African Americans. But for the most part, voting has been a right. What does that suggest about what we think about what the United States is versus, do you know what I mean? If that question makes sense, Timothy.
Well, I know it wasn't always a right for everybody. I mean, in some cases, it was only property owners that could vote.
That's right.
Which, think about this. So say, you're a white man that's 21 years old, but you're poor as all can be. You didn't have the right to vote either in
Correct.
the early days, only
That's right.
property owners. So what happens is when you're only a property owner or only anybody and you're pushing out other people, the voices are not heard.
That's right.
So if only property owners, which would have been people of means, would have been only the people to know, be able to vote and vote on what they wanted. Well, that's not going to help out people that are very poor or, some sort of oppression that they're, like, of course, we're not going to have African Americans be voting because they're slaves at that point, and sure, they're not gonna, so I think we just need to realize that things have changed quite a bit, not just in that everybody's voting, but in the ideas that can you imagine that only property owners could vote? Well, what good is that? I mean, but in their mind, they thought that was great, because they had a stake in the country, so to speak.
That's right.
Some people today think that only taxpayers should vote. If you have if you've paid something into the system, then only taxpayers should vote. I guess that could be a good thing if you think about that. Everybody that pays in wants to be able to control where their tax dollars go. But but what about the people who are not, maybe will be taxpayers? You know what I'm saying? In that vein, that maybe, are we going to keep people out that may be future taxpayers next year or 5 years from now when it could affect them? So you got different points of view.
That's great. Thank you, Timothy. Matthew.
Yes, I think that a lot of the average person would be shocked that the right to vote is not in the Constitution. And the fact that, Timothy was talking about property owners, it wasn't just limited to property, it was white property owners and males, when it first started. And it's just amazing that most people don't realize the history and how it's evolved over the years and how we've had to fight each, blacks, women, just everybody in order to try to get the right for everyone to vote. Now, theoretically, everyone has the right to vote now, but if you work and you have to work, and the only time that you can vote is on election day and it's on a work day on a Tuesday, not really a level playing field as far as access to the vote. And to me, I mean, I really got into it this last time because of all of the mail voting. And I didn't even realize it, that over 65, I was automatically eligible to vote absentee because I had always gone to the polls. But when I looked at Oregon and saw that Oregon has been voting by mail and sending mail ballots to every citizen for the last 20 years. Now you can go vote in person if you want to. And they have had absolutely no problems with any kind of corruption or anything. The biggest flaw that they found is a couple of people who tried to vote in 2 states and they caught them.
Right.
So I mean, this foolishness that by allowing mail ballots and more access through early voting and things like that, that is a detriment to democracy. It's just the opposite.
Yeah, exactly.
I
Well,
mean, when you look at a place like Oregon, I mean, Oregon has like sometimes 80, 85% participation in their elections.
amazing.
Compared to here, and here people think they have such a secure. You go vote on a vote machine here in Louisiana, it doesn't even have a paper trail.
Yeah.
So that's my 2 cents.
Great 2 cents. Well, I appreciate what both of you said here, right? And thinking about access, right? So not only who has the right to vote, but then who can actually access the polls. And then also, you know, historically people have theoretically had the right to vote. Like, you know, after the 15th Amendment in 1870, all Black men theoretically had the right to vote, but they were not able to access that because of violence at the polls. They had to pass literacy tests. There's all these different kinds of clauses that were put on them so that people actually couldn't vote. And as Timothy pointed out earlier, right, thinking about that, and I don't remember the exact date off the top of my head when property requirements were removed from voting. It's somewhere in the 1800s, I think somewhere like early to, or like, I'm not going to guess, it's somewhere around 1850 or earlier, that there's no more property requirement. But to Timothy's point, right, it's like, well, if only propertied white men are voting, whose interests are those people going to uphold? Their own, right? And so when we also want to think about why is it that there's been so much energy put into keeping people away from the polls? You know, why was there so much energy put into keeping Black folks or Black men away from the polls in the late 1800s? Why was there so much energy put into keeping, you know, women away from the polls? You know, what was at stake with women getting the right to vote? You know, be thinking about power, right? A lot of it is about power. And who is going to then have a say and whose interests are going to be represented, right? Okay, anybody else want to, and then also, right, this question about, you know, it kind of, it might make us rethink, what does democracy mean, right? Because if the nation was founded as a democracy, but only a very small percentage of people could vote, does that challenge our notion of a democracy? I mean, I don't know, but it's just something to think about, right? And when we think about how people have had to fight tooth and nail to get the vote, even, you know, after women supposedly get the vote in 1920, and I say supposedly because what the 19th Amendment does is it says you cannot restrict the vote on account of sex. And what's really interesting about that wording is that doesn't say that you can't restrict the vote on account of other reasons, right? So after the 19th Amendment passes, Black women still can't vote in the South because of Jim Crow and all the voter intimidation, the literacy tests and all of that, right? So we also want to be thinking about, when do different groups of people actually get the access to the vote? Because there's the laws and there's the legislation, but then there's the actual access. And those are sometimes very different moments. Okay, you all. Let's see. So let's see, I'm trying to think of another, I'm just kind of jumping through these questions. Okay, so here's kind of a meta question. Thinking about, so question number 6, right? The author Tetrault asks us to consider how we tell our histories and why that is important. History doesn't just exist, but rather it is made. So does this mean that nothing in our history books is true? What do you all think?
I think it's a question that's like whose story we get to tell, and the question of narrative is also tied to to things like voting, because you have the sort of mythical narrative that everyone is, you know, equal here and we all can vote. And then you have the kind of suppressed histories where, you know, in reality, there are all of these roadblocks or just even legislation barring people. So what gets told as an inclusive, as a sort, like what gets told as this is a representative democracy, it's the powerful who are telling that. So the things that we see in our history books are true often, but they're often, you know, there's so much that happens you can't make in the world in history. You have to have a narrative to make sense of it.
That's right.
So when we learn what happened, we have to learn like what's the story of it. So, you know, the things in our history books are true for the most part, but they also may be lacking context. They may be, it's kind of like when you read the news, like as librarians, we ask people to, you know, we place a lot of value on when we read primary sources, even like newspapers, watching the news, that kind of thing. What is the spin of like the person telling the story? And there's always some kind of spin because there's always someone who's telling whose kind of perspective it's coming from.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Because also in thinking about when we write history, you know, to write history, you need the primary sources. So depending on what sources you're looking at, you're going to maybe tell a different narrative, right? So if you're looking at particular newspapers, if you're looking at women's diaries, right? Even what is considered a historical source, right? Prior to like, let's say 40 years ago, women's journals and diaries are like, oh, that's just women writing. Who cares, right? I can't tell y'all the incredible histories that have been written, the rich histories that have been written based on women's journals, because you can learn so much, you glean so much from the past from that, right? It's not just like women like blue, 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 writing about whatever. So even that's part of it too, is like, what sources are you looking at? You know, if you're writing a history, let's say of slavery, and prior to the 1930s, so there were no like what we call oral histories, which are basically interviews done with enslaved people until the 1930s, which is like incredible, right? That it took that long, almost, if I do the math right, 65 years after the end of the Civil War. But if you tell a history of slavery in the United States with those sources versus a history of the United States without those sources, how those might look different. So yeah, so thinking about, you know, how stories get told again, right? Which is not to say the history books are not true, but it is to say that history as a discipline has changed I'd say pretty dramatically over time. So that a US history book that was written in 1965 is going to look quite different from a US history book written in 2015, for example. So that's just something to think about, like as history, as a discipline evolves and how we change our understanding of the past, of the sources we look at, the voices that we seek out, how that's then going to change how we reconstruct the past, right? Matthew, what are you going to say?
Well, and when it comes to another fact is like when it comes to textbooks, there's like this panel somewhere in Texas that pretty much determines what's going to go in, you know, who's going to go into the history books and stuff for high school kids and stuff like that. So you're back to talking about power again, because these people, I forgot one of these guys that sits on there and determines who's, you know, whether Benjamin Franklin goes in or someone else goes in. I mean, the guy's a dentist.
Yeah.
He doesn't have any standing at all to be making these kind of decisions. But and that has a big influence of what goes into textbooks that are distributed throughout this country,
Mhm.
which is ridiculous.
Mhm.
But anyway.
Yeah. No, I mean, you make a really important point here in thinking about politics and the politics of history. So it is true. I think it's Texas and California are the two states, and I don't know exactly all the details, but this is where Texas and California, because I think they purchase the most textbooks, or I'm not sure what it is, but anyway, they have a huge stake and a huge claim in what ends up in those textbooks. And that's really problematic, right? And I don't know who sits on those boards and who makes those decisions, if they're actually historians or dentists. I really don't know. But the fact, that there is a small group of people making these decisions about what school children nationwide are going to learn can often result in some really problematic things. Like, so for example, very often, gay and lesbian folks or LGBTQ are left out of textbooks because this small group of people determine that that is not a history that's quote unquote appropriate for children. It's weird because like we're all humans, and last time I checked, any kinds of human history is appropriate for children. But and then there was another instance where, I don't know if you all remember this, but a couple of years ago, I think it was like, I don't know if it was Macmillan or McGraw-Hill, but it was a huge publisher. And in their textbook, they referred to enslaved people who were brought from Africa here as workers. Like literally they were workers, which assumes, typically you think of workers are paid people who are not brought against their will, et cetera, right? Who are not enslaved. And thinking about like who made the decision, who chose that language, who said, okay, yeah, this is an appropriate representation of slavery. But again, it's that the politics of history, who's making those decisions, and then what is the story that gets told, right? So Matthew, thank you for bringing that up. Timothy.
Okay, so we can look at history in a general sense when we see something like, for instance, in some of the school books that I had younger on, like 7th, 8th grade or whatever, you may have something that was maybe not extraordinarily important, but it may have been important, but they were only able to put maybe 3 lines in that history book. Because
Right.
if we put everything, we'd have 5-foot tall books,
That's right.
So there's a lot more nuance to history than what we get in history books, and maybe not for a good reason, but because of reason of economy of the size of the books, and
Right.
we're only going to be able to get through so much anyhow. So there's an omission there, not necessarily because they're trying to omit something to give a different narrative. It's just on the economy of the book, so to speak. The other thing too is that you spoke of the interviews that were done. The government had paid for these interviews to be done for former slaves that were still alive. And you said, think of the narrative that we're able to understand from just that. But think about this, most of those people were children in slavery.
Right. That's right.
So think about this. What if they would have done these interviews in 1910 instead of 1930?
No.
The perspective would have been different, because these people would have also been older. They may have bared or fathered children. They may have been sold and that kind of stuff. And one of the things I like to do, I read a lot about Louisiana history. And one of the things that, we have a lot of sayings. And a lot of those sayings, people don't even know where they come from. So like, for instance, there's a saying called, well, they done sold you down the river. Okay. That saying comes from slavery.
Yeah.
And that what that saying comes from is that when Virginia and Kentucky, they were getting so many slaves that they were more, the slaves were more than the crops that the slaves were actually tilling. And so they needed so many slaves in South Louisiana because of sugar that slaves did not want to get sold down the river, because that means that you may go, but your whole other family that's on the plantation is not going to be there.
That's right.
And so you also knew that if you were a man that was going to work in the sugar fields, it was a death sentence, because you were only good for about 4 or 5 years and your body wore out. So just little things about history that we see that people don't even know that it exists and why it exists, and it's a historical thing.
Right. Yeah. And you have raised so many important points here. What you're talking about, the selling down the river, that's part of the internal slave trade. So I think it's 1807 where there's, the trafficking of slaves from Africa or, to the United States is banned. So therefore you see the emergence of this massive internal slave trade, and enslaved people are being sold from the upper South to the lower South, right? Into the sugar fields of Louisiana, the cotton fields of Texas. You see this huge movement. And when I, mentioned earlier, the violence of slavery, part of that violence was the separation of families, that you just spoke about, Timothy. And thinking about, right, so those narratives, those oral histories that we get in the 1930s as part of FDR's New Deal under the Federal Writers Project, again, those people were children when they were enslaved, and now they're in their 70s and their 80s. So when historians do use those sources, they have to also keep in mind, right, the history of memory and what memories people are going to have. Are they going to be accurate? But yeah, like imagine, right, if it was 1905, if it had been deemed important to interview formerly enslaved people to learn about their experiences, right? But it was determined that those people and their histories weren't important, so their histories were not taken. So thank you for all of that. And also, right, the history books, right? The history books can't put everybody in there. It can't have everything in there, right? There's too much. So I guess my question to you all then is, whose stories do get told, right? If there's barely any women in those history books, if there's barely any people of color in those history books, right? So it's kind of, again, I guess that question of whose stories are deemed important, and then how do we expand those books to be more inclusive, but not have them be 10,000 pages long, right? Okay.
So I got to comment on that too.
Yeah.
Okay, so the government is like a huge ship. It just doesn't turn on a dime. So sometimes, even though someone in 1900 thought that those would have been great voices to hear, by the time that it gets through everything and they start lobbying for it and everything, it may not be in for 25 years till it's done. So that does work out like that. So you said, whose voices get heard, who writes the history?
Mm-hmm.
It's the people who think it's important enough to do it themselves. It's something that we need to do ourselves. If we have a history of South Louisiana that we want to tell, then maybe we should go out there and start doing it on our own also.
Yeah.
And take up the flag and say, look, we're going to tell this history and we're going to talk about it. Louisiana has one of the most important histories according to North America. It also has one of the people that have come here, all the different peoples that have come here, makes a big difference. We are just now starting to see more and more history books on that, and how I think it's Dr. Henry Louis Gates that said stuff like, history, which you think is going to be the history, you're going to be surprised, because it has a lot more details than just what you see on the surface.
That's right. Yeah. No, and you're right. So, and that's a lot of the work that folks have been doing is documenting their histories and make sure their histories get told, right? Native Americans, the first Native American history written from a Native American perspective is somewhere in the late 1970s. I'm not remember the exact year, but it's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. It's a Native American historian writing about Native American history from the standpoint of Native Americans, because prior to that, it had all been written from the standpoint of white folks. And their views of Native people as savage, as, uncivilized, et cetera, et cetera. So Timothy, you're absolutely right. And that speaks to one of our earlier questions, right, about people reclaiming their histories and writing their histories, and make sure that those are the histories that get told, right? So Ashley, we have until 7. Are we at time?
I believe, let's see.
Or do we go till 7:30? I'm not sure, but let me read Renee's comment here. So she said, when I worked at the library and was in book club, we made sure that we read different genres every month. Yeah, we made it a point to have different things. Black Cowboys of the Old West, one was for Black History Month. Yeah, absolutely, right? So that you get, a sense of the diverse experiences. It's important to do that, to get a more complete and whole picture. Let's get into women's suffrage now. So we've talked a lot about kind of like the meta and thinking about history and the politics of history, who writes history, whose histories get told. And so let's talk about, what we read in the book here, and thinking about this master narrative of Seneca Falls, right? And the origins of the women's rights movement in 1848. So let's see, let me find the question that speaks to that. Well, I guess so thinking about what do you all think about this idea of this master narrative that gets created? You have the origin is 1848, but that idea that 1848 is a starting point doesn't actually materialize until, over 25 years later, when it's then decided, oh, this is our starting point, right? It's interesting to think about when we think about history, in our heads, we like to think about like, okay, here's the beginning, the middle, and the end, right? We do that for everything, right? The civil rights movement has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The women's liberation movement does. The Great Depression, the New Deal, the war, World War II. And in some ways, yes, the war starts on a very specific day, right? The war ends on a very specific day. But very often, right, those borders are a lot more fuzzy. Okay, yeah, Matthew, that's totally fine. If you have to go, I think it might have only been an hour, so don't worry about it if you have to go. But anyway, so what do you all think about this kind of creation of an origin in 1848? What purpose does that actually ultimately serve in creating that origin story?
I felt that the creation of this narrative, because like when we talk about you need to learn that, like women need to learn the history of women's suffrage or of of women's rights. Again, I think it's like a storytelling thing, and I only skimmed the book, but it's like you have so many nebulous things, and at certain points it was really deeply intertwined with the abolitionist struggle, or it was like stories that don't tell themselves. And if you can situate yourself or the people coming after you as like part of this tradition of struggle, or like you give, it's the whole like point of like the myth where like you give like sort of a purpose to it, and you have something to look to, like for like someone to look up to, like a female women's rights hero to look up to. And even though Seneca Falls was apparently not that grand of an occasion, it's still something to look back on. And so yeah.
No, that's exactly it, right? I mean, it's this kind of creation of a myth, which is not to say, right, Seneca Falls, the meeting did happen, right? But this kind of mythologizing about what it meant and what it did, and what it means to the entire movement, right? That's where you get the story created around it. And exactly as you're saying, it suggests that here's this origin, and these are the women who led the way. And not only did they lead the way, but they're going to continue leading the way into the future. And that their way is the way that the movement should continue to go. So it's fascinating because it was like, it's almost this kind of like contest for who is going to win control of the narrative, means who's going to win control of the movement and the future of the movement. It's totally fascinating. And that's exactly what happens, right? So Lucy Stone gets written out essentially of the movement. Susan B. Anthony rises as, right, the mother of the movement. She wasn't even at the Seneca Falls Convention, right? So it's just like, whoa, right? As you're reading it and looking at, we have a national park in New York in Seneca Falls, right? The National Park Service has the national park for Seneca Falls. This story that was created, in what is it, 1866 or 1870? It's 25 years after. I'm doing my math. In 1873, I think, is when they create the origin story of Seneca Falls. And it's so powerful to the point that we have a national park that says so. I mean, it's really, really interesting when you think about the purpose that the narrative served and the impact that it had, right? So let's see. So, and this is a point that gets back to what Timothy said earlier about writing our own histories. It's question 13. So Susan B. Anthony wrote that, quote, woman will never be properly recorded in history until they do the work themselves. Right? That makes me think about Timothy, what you were saying about the history of Louisiana. We have to write it ourselves. So while she was speaking about women, and specifically white women, many other minoritized groups have also had to, quote, do the work themselves and record their own history. So why was that the case in Stanton's time? Why did women have to write their own histories in the 19th century? And why has it been the case for so many other groups, whether we're thinking about the working class, immigrants, Chicana, Black folks, Native Americans? Why do these groups have to do the work themselves and record their own histories?
Well, I believe that they have to do it themselves because no group is really worried about the other group. They're only worried about themselves. I mean, we have in life, we have a selfish bent. We're kind of more worried about ourselves than we're worried about other groups. Okay. So I think that we have to write it ourselves because we may be closer to the situation. Also, we may be closer to the problems that, that we're going through. And it's always problems because if it's good things, it's not going to be much of a movement, But so, it seems like we're always trying to figure out what the problems are and get those problems taken care of. Another thing too, think about when this came about, how many, you may have a reporter going in to talk of war or about this guy that was a sheriff that killed 45 bad guys or whatever the case may be. But how many women reporters did you have at the time? How many women history writers did you have at the time? You may have had women that were writing romantic books or poems or something, but how many were going out to do historical books? I bet you for the most part it was all men. And of course, because of literacy, it was probably all white men. I mean, that's just how the history was. So I'm thinking also that you have to look at times also and look and see what was going on at the time as to whether that may have been easy. Nowadays, you have probably more women writers than men. So you're going to probably get more of a woman's point of view there than you would say a man's point of view. And they're writing about everything, not just what we would think of as what women traditionally, right? They're writing about all kinds of things. So, you get a different perspective also in a different time of your progression of your country.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a really good point, right? Think about who is writing, like who has access to universities, who then has access to becoming professionally trained historians, right? Who has access to becoming doctors, who has access to becoming lawyers, right? And that's going to vary, based on race, class, gender, so on and so forth. And then, right, and then those people who do become historians and who are writing history, whose histories do they think are important? Probably their own, right? Thinking about whose histories they're going to write about. Renee chatted in. Folks probably thought, well, what's the issue? We're handling things. Women are happy. Slaves are happy the way with the way things are. They don't have opinions. And that's exactly right. Right. People made there were these ideas, in the late 1800s and the 19th century, right? It was still believed that white women were controlled by their uteruses, right? That they were, it was this kind of dehumanization. So of course, like the idea of a women's history, if you're coming from a viewpoint of women, as lesser than, as inferior, as not having sharp minds, that's absolutely going to influence the stories that get told, or what's deemed worthy of reporting on, right? As Timothy was saying. So you have all of those things going on. And what's so incredible about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott, as she says in the book, is that this is before history as a discipline really has fully emerged or has fully formed. And what these women are doing is they're creating an archive before the idea of a public archive even existed, right? So nowadays, right, we have like the Louisiana State Records. We have incredible archives at Hill Memorial Library on LSU's campus, right? I mean, there's archives all over the country on a million different topics. Because people understand the value in preserving papers, ephemera, whatever it is, and building these archives, so that we can then, write about the past. But in the 1800s, there was no such thing as the public archive, the way we understand it today. And Stan and Anthony start collecting all these papers from all these women that were part of the women's rights movement and the women's suffrage movement. And they literally build an archive, and they write a women's history. And they're really like amongst the first women historians of their time, at a time when, you didn't have like academically trained women's historians, and history as a discipline is just emerging. Like the American Historical Association, I think, organizes in the 1880s or something. So it's fascinating that they actually take on this work, because they recognize how important it is to tell the story, because they're also up against, as Renee said, people, are just thinking, oh, well, women are just happy, or they're mindless, or they haven't contributed anything, or whatever. And so they had to set the record straight, right? Which is what a lot of folks, right, who aren't in positions of power historically have to do. They then have to set the record straight. That studying the history of the working class is important, right? This is monumental in the 1960s. Like, what? Why would we study the history of poor and working class people? That's new in the 1960s. It's like, yeah, these are people whose lives are worth studying. They're worth knowing about, right? A lot of the movers and shakers in this country are not people who come from, in positions of power. So thinking about this idea of people having to do the work themselves, because otherwise either it won't get done or the histories won't be told, I guess, authentically or properly, or, from a position of the people who live those histories, right? Okay. Okay, let's talk about, so question 15. This is curious. I'm interested to see what you all think. So Stanton and Anthony believe that accessing the vote was the single most important goal for women's rights. So what do you all think are the major women's rights issues of our time today? Like, what issues are women confronting today, either in Louisiana or nationally, that you would think, that you think that maybe 30 years from now, historians might write about? Renee says equal pay. Absolutely. That's a major issue. And I think in Louisiana, I think we have like one of the larger wage gaps in the nation. And of course, that also breaks down according to race as well, right? So I think very often, I think we see, 77 cents to the dollar, like for every dollar men make, women make 77 cents. But if you break it down further, I think like white women make 84 cents, Black women make like 65 cents, Native women make 54 cents or something like that. So it even further breaks down. Let's see, Renee, the jobs that we're allowed to do, same with sports, absolutely, right? And that's something that's also really interesting that has changed dramatically over time, women in labor and women in work. And so where women are expected to be in the workforce, and where they've had to fight tooth and nail to be in that workforce, right? Sports as well. And that there's been a huge shift in sports since Title IX and women having access to sports. But even thinking about, for example, with all due respect to the men's soccer team, the national men's soccer team, which is a great team, the women's soccer team is like next level amazing. They are like literally some of the best women athletes in the world. And they get paid something like, I'm just going to completely make it up, right? Like women soccer players get paid $100 per game and the men get paid $800 per game. You know, obviously those numbers are way off, but you know what I mean in terms of the discrepancy. So that's, you know, that kind of connects what you're saying, Renee, with the equal pay and the sports. What are some other issues, women's rights issues that are happening in our own time?
I think both like reproductive issues as well as issues of discrimination against mothers in so you know, you have reproductive health that we need, right, that we, you know, are fighting for rights over, as well as when you become a mother, all of a sudden there are all these different ways in which it's kind of legal to pay you less, for a man to depend on your housework, you know, and be more likely to have to quit your job to take care of the children, and the amount of capital or labor that you're generating as a house worker and then a mother being degraded. Like, I think the treatment of like mothers in this in our culture is really yeah, it's really a big problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that feminists have been, we're, you know, talking about since the 1970s, right? That kind of the unpaid labor of housework, the labor that's just expected. You know, if you think about, you know, do you guys remember that show Mad Men, about the marketing, you know, guys on Madison Avenue in New York City in like the 60s?
My girlfriend's dying, like the thing that she will have me watch Mad Men.
Yeah.
Like that is her goal. So
yeah. Well, the costume is so great. The costuming is so great in the show. But I mean, like when you're talking about like the unpaid labor, right? For all of those marketing execs, for all those execs, right? Who's ironing their clothes? Who's making their food? Who's raising the children? Who's keeping the house clean, right? When you're talking about all this kind of unpaid labor, this devalued unpaid labor that women do, that then allow, right, for the partners, you know, their husbands to be successful businessmen, but the women get kind of written out of the story as they're not doing any work, whereas they're doing, you know, all that support work that, right, those marketing men could never do what they're doing without them. Absolutely, reproductive rights is still a major women's rights issue. You know, the right to abortion, which I know is huge and contentious, is a major women's rights issue that continues to be debated to this time. Other issues around maternity. I think Louisiana has some of the highest rates of maternal mortality in the nation. Maternal health care is really, really not in a good, not in a good way here in Louisiana. We have a lot of issues there.
I think especially like my mom is a midwife, or she's just became a midwife, and she's been a labor and delivery nurse for 30 something years.
Wow.
But she's like the maternal mortality rate, but especially Black women's maternal mortality rate. So a lot of I think some of the worst issues, like or some of the most biggest issues that we face as women are of course compounded for women of color.
That's right.
because it's like exponentially more dangerous to give birth as a Black woman than as a white woman. And as a white woman, it's already,
Yeah.
pretty dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So when you think about all those, compounding factors, influenced by race and class, right? Access to good healthcare, access to resources, access to all these things, and how that's going to impact somebody's experience. Renee also said our limited roles in the Catholic Church. Thinking about, the Catholic Church and other religious and non-religious institutions, right, that have a hierarchy where, men are at the very top. And have all the control, right? So it's definitely not limited to the Catholic Church, but that's also something that you see there, right? So in other words, right, there are still plenty of women's rights issues in our own time that people are still fighting for, and that, historians will write about in 20 or 30 years. And it'll be interesting, sometimes we forget that we're living in our own historical moment. Although I think in the year of, everything that's gone down, from George Floyd to COVID to, just this, the past 4 years of politics, I think it's very clear that we're living through a historical moment. I don't think anybody would deny that, especially after the past year. But sometimes we do forget that, like, we're also living through history and we're history makers, and that what will the history be that gets told about our own time? It's interesting to be thinking about that, and whose stories now are going to be told later, and how will those stories get told, is really something to be thinking about. Let's see. So I don't know if folks read the epilogue, if y'all got all the way to the end, but I'll ask the question in case anybody did, because I couldn't believe this. So Thomas says, that's absolutely another issue, is this issue of trans women in sports. That is completely blown up also, and that's absolutely a women's rights issue. I saw this really powerful meme, actually, and it was just like, trans women in sports are not a threat to women's sports. What is a threat to women's sports are predatory coaches who are going after young girls. And I was like, ooh, boom, correct. But anyway, and then thinking about how issues get framed, and what is seen, right? And like, whose rights, boom, right? Wasn't that so good? Because you think about like the women's Olympic gymnastics team, right? I mean, you always hear these stories about, predatory men in girls and women's sports. So it's terrifying. But so in thinking about, how the different issues then get framed now, and then, who gets framed as the noble people, who gets framed as, all of these kinds of things, I think is really so interesting. Okay. So I don't know if y'all got to the epilogue, but in the epilogue, it says that, Susan B. Anthony had built this expansive archive in her attic, and then they burn a huge part of it. And if nobody got to the epilogue, that's fine. We don't have to talk about it. But if anybody did get to the epilogue, because I got there and I was like, whoa. And so what do we make of Susan B. Anthony burning a huge portion of her papers towards the end of her life?
I did not get there. Did she burn them herself, or did someone burn them for her? Or did she want them burned? Let's put it that way.
Yeah, so it was her and her assistant decided to burn them themselves. Yeah, it was at her home in her backyard. And so they decide to burn the papers. Yeah.
And what was the reasoning?
It seems like the reason was to kind of make the one official source, a history of women's suffrage, to be like the source for like her like biographical information. So you couldn't go digging through these archives and seeing like this unapproved like stuff. You would have to like consult what she put out as the history.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah, exactly right. Because so what she had worked so hard to do is create this whole narrative, right, of the origin story, the history of women's vote, right? She's at the center of it. You know, her way is the right way, and they're going to continue in this way. And what that history does is it turns out to be very exclusionary. You know, Black women are very much left out of that history. Her opponents, other women who also were in fighting for women's rights and women's suffrage, if they didn't agree with her, then they were left out of that history. So she creates this, history of women's suffrage. It's multi-volume. I think eventually it has 6 volumes ultimately. And they have this huge archive, and also the drafts of that history of women's history. I'm not saying, what is the actual title of the thing? Anyway, other women's rights activists are mad about what she's writing. They don't like some of the stuff they're saying it's not right, blah, blah, blah. And then she burns the archive, right? So as Ashley says, so it's like the history then is the one that got documented, and you don't have evidence of another history. I mean, it is shady, y'all. Right? If you think about it, it's like, whoa, like, was she that calculating?
So it sounds to me that she was just a narcissist. I mean, because she wanted for her to be the top dog and only her narrative to come out.
Mm-hmm.
Correct?
Well,
okay.
Yeah.
So if you have that kind of thing, so did she use women's suffrage just to become famous, or to be looked at as a leader? If women had the right to vote then, would she have changed and done something else to get herself in the history book, so to speak?
No, No, I definitely don't think that she was dedicated to the cause of women's suffrage. Like, I don't think she was just doing it so that she could be like big dog on top. Do you know what I mean? But what the author kind of like her argument throughout is that Anthony, wants to control the narrative because she sees women's vote as the most important issue for women's rights, right? And that's debatable, right? There's a lot of different of women's rights activists think that there's other things that women should be focusing on that are more important than the vote, right? But Anthony is saying, no, the vote is the singular most important thing, and here is how we should go about obtaining that vote. Here's how we should fight for that vote, and here's what we need to do. So I don't think it's a matter of her having like a narcissistic personality, or like it was more of her wanting to shape and in a way control the movement. And part of shaping that movement and controlling the movement is controlling the narrative, and controlling what the history of that movement is, so that she then has her volume of the history of the women's suffrage movement becomes the source, as opposed to one source amongst many sources, right? Because what they write is not necessarily untrue, but it doesn't include everybody. Does that make sense?
Well, it does, but then you get to a point where, by her excluding all these other people, and I would think that they were mostly all women at this point, trying to put forth whatever narrative, you push down other people.
That's right.
So when a movement comes around that is good for a particular type of people, you would think that everything that pertains to them would be good, and that needs to come forward also. Right. So what she did was she pushed down a lot of women so that she could have her narrative of what she wanted to go. And I've heard this before, and I don't remember where I heard this, but I heard one time a woman was saying that, I've never, my head was never scarred up from hitting the glass ceiling, but my ankles were sure all scarred up by all other women trying to pull me back down in the bucket. Okay. And so it makes you think, why would someone try to push down others so that only your narrative, only because you think it's the most important thing? We do know it was important, because then all other issues could be voted on after they get the right to vote, right? But I don't know, it kind of makes me feel bad that other people were being pushed down because of her singularness in vision,
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting because she recognizes how important having the control of the narrative, the history is, because how important that is to then shaping the movement and its future. But from our standpoint, we're looking at it like, oh my God, like how could she have done that? But it's important to remember, right? I mean, she really believes that like this movement should proceed a very particular way, and that if we want to get to the, we have to, if we want to get votes for women, we have to get, eventually she's fully on board with the constitutional amendment. And also, really this idea of like an organized, centralized movement, whereas the women's suffrage movement was totally decentralized. You have state organizations, local organizations, they're all kind of doing their own thing. It's a very messy movement, but she wants to kind of bring it all together and control it, which to us, is pretty kind of off-putting to read about and realize. But I think, the question to ask is, why is she doing that? What is she thinking? And what is the ultimate end goal there? Right? Like, I don't want to totally just like bash Susan B. Anthony, and I don't think you were, but thinking about like what motivates her and why is she making the particular choices that she's making during her time period, if that makes sense, right? Like what is it that she's ultimately seeking? But yeah, it's totally fascinating. Like when y'all get to the later chapters of the book, if you haven't already, like, it's all about that. And then like, the burning of the archive at the end, again, just, speaks to this, her need to tell the story as her story. And it is incredibly damaging, right? Because then, well, as we'll be reading about next week in Vanguard, Black women's role in the suffrage movement gets almost completely left out. And part of that is because white women, particularly in the South, did not organize with Black women, but also in the North, because of racism and white supremacy. Absolutely. That was the case. But, Black women were fierce fighters for the vote, and, absolutely, made their mark and drove the women's voting rights movement in really significant ways. And that's a movement that continued into the 1960s, well past the 19th Amendment. And we arguably could say it continues to this very day, given all the voter suppression that's been going on. Is there anything, so maybe in our last 10 or 15 minutes or so, I don't know, are we going till 8 o'clock? Is that what we decided?
So the library does close at 8. So,
okay.
In the future, next week, I will be talking to Chriselle and seeing how long it should be going.
Okay.
And I can, if I need somebody to stay with me, I can ask another staff member, but I would like to be over a little bit, 5 minutes before 8 o'clock, so that I can get out of the building with the rest of the staff.
Oh, that's totally fine. In fact, I mean, what we could do is like, end for 7:45, so that way you have the time to collect your things or whatever. So let's wrap it up then, right? We have about 7 more minutes. And Ashley, we appreciate you staying here with us, through all of this. So Renee's question was, so the movement included primarily white women with Susan B. Anthony. Yeah, like when you're looking at the National Women's Suffrage Association, which then morphs into the larger, like the National American Women's Suffrage Association, this is primarily white women, because Black women organized their own suffrage associations, because again, right, I mean, segregation was the law of the land. And also, when white women were making arguments for women's vote, what they really meant was white women's vote. They really weren't concerned. Okay, Thomas, thank you so much for joining. We'll see you next week for sure. So yeah, so it's like, you know, the suffrage movement is very diverse, but it's not united across race, if that makes sense. And in fact, in 1920, right, when we get the 19th Amendment, Black women come back to these organizations and say, look, like, we still can't access the polls in the South because of literacy tests, because of violence at the polls, you know, all the ways that Black folks had been disenfranchised. And the, you know, the National Women's Party, which was one of the major groups at that time, said, well, you know, that's not a women's rights issue, that's a race issue. So we can't help you with that. That's not a women's issue, right? So again, women really gets coded as white women. Yeah, it's incredibly problematic. And so, you know, Black women continue to fight for the vote, and eventually gets a, you know, that work gets us the 1965 Voting Rights Act, wherein, you know, Black folks are finally able to register and access the polls in the South and nationwide. The Voting Rights Act opens up access not just for Black folks, but also Native Americans who have been kept from the polls. You know, I did a whole lecture on this, but you know, a bunch of different groups of people, you know, racially minoritized groups of people who are kept from the polls in different states. So yeah. Okay, so but in our last 5 minutes, is there anything else that you all wanted to talk about? Any questions you had about the book, or, you know, any further comments about anything that we've already talked about tonight, and or any feedback? Because, you know, next week my plan is to basically kind of run this the same way. Does that work for you guys? You know. Oh, I'm glad this is so interesting. Awesome, Renee. Cool. Yeah, I've been really enjoying the conversation with you all. But any other questions, y'all, or anything you want to follow up on? It was fine. Cool, Timothy. Okay, cool. All right, so next week, we're going to be reading Vanguard. Let me get the full title correctly here. How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. This book, so the book that we read for this week was written by an academic historian. It was published by an academic press, and it was written, you know, mostly for an academic audience. The book that we're reading next week, she's also an academic, she's a historian, she's at Johns Hopkins, but her book is very much written for a popular audience. So I hope you all enjoy it. Several of the Black women who are mentioned in this book, you'll see in Vanguard next week. So anyway, yeah, it's a really good, I think it's a really interesting read. I hope that you all find it approachable and interesting. And we'll come back and we'll do this again next Tuesday. So thanks everybody for being here. And then Ashley, you were gonna work on getting Renee copies of the book. Okay.
Yes, I should be able to get audio for Vanguard and possibly for Locked Out. One person, no vote. Or no, one person, no vote. Locked Out, I don't think I can get those, but I'm gonna do my best.
Okay, cool. Yeah, access is important, so we appreciate anything you can do. And again, Timothy, thank you so much for your good conversation tonight. Renee, thank you also for chatting in and your conversation. And Ashley, thank you. This was great. So I look forward to talking with you all next week.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming.
See y'all next week.
Okay.
Y'all have a wonderful evening.